Everyone's heard of George Lucas, but did you know all of the series of events that had to fall just perfectly for Star Wars to even exist? When George Lucas was in film school, he connected with a number of people who would change his life forever.
The Dirty Dozen was a movie that by Robert Aldrich about World War II, I guess. Someone in the press called the C group that I was with the Dirty Dozen because we had 12 guys who all went and had careers at the same time that took off. And it was unusual because we were all in the same class together.
And Lucas was making waves with his student films, so much so that by the time he graduated in 1966, it had even made an impact on those outside of the USC bubble. Primarily a young filmmaker who was a freshman at rival Long Beach State University, Steven Spielberg. But Hollywood of the 1960s had no room for this new wave of exciting filmmakers. So they flocked to a hero their own age, one they saw as the godfather of sorts.
Nothing is so terrible as a pretentious movie. I mean, a movie that aspires for something really terrific and doesn't pull it off is shit, it's scum. And everyone will walk on it as such. And that's why poor filmmakers, in a way, that's their greatest horror, is to be pretentious. And it's very hard to talk about these things without being very corny. You use a word like self-purgation or epiphany, they think you're either a religious weirdo or an asshole college professor. But those are the words for the process, this transmutation, this renaissance, this rebirth.
Lucas and Coppola would meet in the summer of 1967 as the winner of the student scholarship Lucas, the star student, was awarded 6 months on the Burbank lot. As he wandered onto the lot, only one film was under production, Finian's Rainbow, a take on the Broadway show about a leprechaun and his search for a pot of gold. Lucas snuck onto the set, hoping to just observe from the shadows, and almost immediately there was a booming voice asking who he was and what he was doing on set. Coppola had spent his early time in Hollywood working under Roger Corman, along with other distinguished names, such as Martin Scorsese, James Cameron, Jonathan Demme, and Ron Howard. As Lucas looked around the set, one thing was clear: Hollywood had gotten old. Other than he and Coppola, no one else was under 50 years old. You've heard the old adage, opposites attract, and like different polarities of a magnet, Coppola and Lucas began an unlikely friendship. Lucas, the shy, quiet one, once said of the difference between the two, "My life has no anecdotes. Francis's life is one big anecdote." After being hired as Coppola's administrative assistant, Lucas had shown Francis one of his short films he made while lecturing at USC, entitled THX 1138 4HB. Coppola was blown away and would regularly tell Lucas he had to make it into a full-length film. It was this encouragement and pressure that Lucas needed, because in many ways, without THX, there would be no Star Wars.
I had a choice of going back to graduate school or going off on this little adventure, and I decided to go off on the adventure with Francis. He couldn't pay me. I was sort of the assistant everything, and he couldn't pay me. So he said, "What I'll do is I'll get you a deal to write a screenplay, THX, which I just won the National Student Film Festival Award with, and I was kind of trying to see if I could get it off the ground as a movie." And he said, "I'll get you you can write the screenplay, and then you can be the assistant everything on this movie, and we'll travel across the country." So I thought that would be a great idea.
But to get there, something had to change, because as it stood, Hollywood was not a place for young filmmakers.
Francis wrote a script that involved a cross-country journey. It was supposed to be kind of an existential leap into the unknown. In fact, they wound up in Nebraska. And they said, if we can do this in Nebraska, there's no reason that we have to be in Hollywood. And it was within 3 or 4 months after that Francis had made the decision to set up American Zoetrope in San Francisco.
Francis wanted to own everything that you needed to make a film. He wanted to own the cameras, own the lights and sound, own the editing machine and the building. He didn't want to have to answer to anybody. He wanted to be able to mount a movie 2 days after he thought of it if he wanted to.
It was time to open his own studio, and he did it in San Francisco, naming it American Zoetrope, with the mission: the essential objective of the company is to engage in the varied fields of filmmaking, collaborating with the most gifted and youthful talent, using the most contemporary techniques and equipment possible.
In a way, Francis attempted to be all of our godfathers. You know, to this day he calls me Stevie, little Stevie Spielberg. You know, I love it, but only he calls me that. But he would always sort of have us sitting at his feet listening to the way movies should be made, because Francis, of our entire group, he was actually a generation before mine, but Francis was the first young guy ever to make.
And it was spending time around this creativity and desire to push the envelope that would be the precursor to Lucas's eventual creation of industrial light and magic, where for years ILM would reset the entire standard of filmmaking and change the film industry as we know it. Coppola was able to secure the needed funds for this project from the Warners by making a deal involving the expanded script of, you guessed it, THX, and another promised war movie, though if none of the movies came through, they would have to pay back the money.
Temporary story, it's about today, and therefore I want to make it out of existing things so that everything there is real, only altered slightly in order to give it a kind of alien look.
Not only did Coppola push Lucas to make THX, he also told him that he had to go learn from this new young producer as he edited the film. His name was Gary Kurtz. Kurtz was also a member of the Roger Corman Academy. He worked on so many of his films, doing so many different jobs, he could not even remember some of their names. But Kurtz's education and career hit a bump in the mid-60s.
The Draft Lottery, a live report on tonight's picking of the birth dates for the draft.
Drafted into the Marine Corps, this tall and sturdy young man was the ideal for the military. Unfortunately, midway through training, Kurtz realized he was a conscientious objector, but instead of being court-martialed, his film talents were used, and so Kurtz served as possibly the only conscientious objector in the Marines during Vietnam. It was this relationship, though, between Kurtz and Lucas that would one day be the foundation for the 1977 classic. Kurtz said of Lucas, "We both came up in the school of doing everything ourselves. He was my kind of filmmaker." But it was also at this time that Coppola and American Zoetrope hit its first major issue.
Coppola gave an impassioned speech about how proud he was of the film Lucas had created, and that Coppola's hands-off producing approach would be replicated on all future American Zoetrope productions. Coppola should have waited to give this speech until after the screening, because the executives at Warner Brothers hated THX 1138. Even though Lucas carefully crafted a film from the future, the film did not make any attempts to explain this concept to the viewer, so the executives found it too inaccessible for mainstream audiences.
We were trying deliberately to be mysterious, which I think is one of the things that drove Warner Brothers mad.
They thought their investment in this new Hollywood and the vision of Coppola was extremely misplaced, and they ordered he repay the $300,000 they initially gave. The studio then took the film and did their own cut of it. It was out of Lucas's hands, and that did not sit well with the young filmmaker, but this is how Hollywood works. Lucas and Kurtz had two ideas moving forward. One, a rock and roll type of biographical piece of Lucas's youth cruising the streets of Modesto, California. And second, a Flash Gordon type space film inspired by a 1958 classic, Hidden Fortress, made by Akira Kurosawa. The first grabbed the attention and interest of United Artists, so they began to work on that film. The deal for this, however, was not a single picture deal. It was common for executives in Hollywood to cover their butts by making a multi-picture deal, and David Picker at United Artists was no different. So the deal was made that the rock and roll film and the Flash Gordon pick as well would all be combined under this one deal. But right when Lucas and Kurtz thought they were made, everything started to crumble and fall apart again.
So when I finished American Graffiti, the Universal was not going to release it. I was dead broke. And so I had to get a job just to live. And so I had this deal to do this space film. And so I went to United Artists with this idea of the space film, and they turned it down. And then I went to Universal for the idea of the space film, and they turned it down.
You see, Richard Walters had been commissioned to write the script for American Graffiti, and when Picker read the first draft, he was not impressed. Everything Lucas had worked for was now in jeopardy.
The risk was never how much could I make on a movie if I read something and liked it. It's how much could I lose. Suppose I'm wrong. How much can I lose?
Picker told the pair if they were willing to rewrite the script for free, he would be willing to move forward. If not, they could go somewhere else. Lucas decided to move on from United Artists, but also to rewrite the script himself. He did it in a month as he remembered his time on the streets of Modesto, California, throwing more of the characters from his youth into the film. He went out with the new script to find a different studio. Kurtz had a connection at Universal, Ned Tannen, who liked the script, and yet again, a two-picture deal was made with the Flash Gordon thing just thrown in. The only caveat is they needed name recognition for a director or producer. By this time, Francis Ford Coppola had just finished a little film called, you guessed it, The Godfather, and so Lucas and Kurtz called in one last favor of their friend, who happily agreed.
Over the years, but he helped me get he basically taught me everything about writing and directing, and then at the same time he got my first film off the ground, and then he helped me get my second film off the ground, and then later on I went and produced one of his film for him.
However, this wasn't just smooth sailing. Even though the film was delivered on time and under budget, Ned Tannen hated the film.
The executive from Universal was there, and he came up to me with a grave face, and he said, we have a lot of work, and I just couldn't believe that he didn't see what he had, and George was cowering in the background, because he didn't want to get in the middle of this, and I remember telling the guy, I said, listen, if Universal doesn't want the picture, I'll buy the picture today for what you have in it. And I remember telling him, I said, you should get on your knees and thank this young man for what he's done for your career.
Leading to a fight between him and Coppola, where Francis offered to buy the film on the spot, but Ned angrily refused and stormed out of the North Point Theater in San Francisco on January 28th, 1973. So yet again, what was thought to be a success was said to be a failure. The studio stood in the way, and it looked like not only was this rock and roll picture dead, the Flash Gordon throw-in was down the toilet with it. But this is where Kurtz came to the rescue. Notes were given to George to change the edit, but his anger and frustration at being told what to do by someone in his estimation who knows nothing about movies meant Kurtz had to get an editor and go to war to save the film. Convincing Tannen to relent on some of the changes was the easy part. The bigger challenge laid in front of them, however. You see, it all comes back to how the film industry would work. When a studio would screen a film, it's usually 10 old men in the room judging the film. But the target audience was the young and nostalgic. So Kurtz had a plan. He was going to pack the theater with as many young staff that he could find to help keep the excitement up.
We kept having screenings, and every time somebody, from the studio, marketing or video, or somebody wanted to see it, we'd always pack the house. We'd get all the secretaries and all the assistants and everybody in the studio we'd invite everybody. So we never let anybody see the film by themselves. We always had, 100 people there.
And it took multiple screenings to convince them, but eventually the green light was given. The release date was set for August 1973. But before that day came, a frustrated Lucas sat down on April 17th, 1973, to work on writing this Flash Gordon film. The wounds left by THX and American Graffiti still fresh. He vowed to not ever be in this position again, where a studio would change his film. And the rest is history.